Hello, good evening. I am Marianne Sanchez and I am the content creator for the Impact Forum. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Professor Tim Jackson, who is with us from UK, I guess. Professor Jackson is an environmental economist, a writer, and he's also the director of the CUSP. It's the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. His last book, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, is a very thought-provoking book, not only because of the topic itself, but also because it manages to put together economy, sociology, philosophy, and quite often poetry as well. So it's a very interesting topic and exercise. So questioning capitalism and the growth paradigm is can be very controversial, but as our forum was about transformation, it seemed pretty natural to also question the foundations of our economies, and also to, as you put it in one of your quotes from Lynn Margulis, to ask questions that can cause discomfort about our culture's sacred norm. So this quote is one of the several that you put in your book. There are a lot of references to a variety of politicians, scientists, economists. It's very interesting to look at the past. It's not new to do this, but it's pretty alive in your book. And my first question would be, do you think we tend to forget past lessons, and what the recent COVID crisis tells us, and what have we learned from it?
I do think we tend to forget the past and the wisdom of the past, and to think of ourselves, if you like, as the cleverest that humanity has ever been. And it may be partly true in technological terms that we are a pretty clever species, but a lot of that wisdom that we've inherited is sometimes lost, I think, in an age of modernity. And that's part of what I wanted to do in the book, was to draw to the surface some of that wisdom and wisdom from across the ages and across different cultures.
Yeah.
And of course, yes, I think we had a lot of lessons through the last 2 years. To me, one of the most basic of those is that it is health rather than wealth, which is the foundation for our prosperity. And when we begin to make decisions on the basis of health rather than wealth, we do different things. And we did very, very different things, of course, during the pandemic. But one of the most interesting aspects of the difference between health and wealth is that wealth is very much about having more and more, about accumulation. And health is very much about balance, about having what is right rather than just having more for the sake of it. And that's a lesson that goes back centuries. You can look at Aristotle's work around the good life, and that's exactly what he was saying at that point. And I think we have forgotten that until the pandemic reminded us.
Okay. And do you think beyond health there are also other lessons that are going to last, or not really?
Well, we don't know exactly how long anything is going to last, to be honest. But we are tending to forget some of what we learned remarkably quickly. I mean, in both our countries, actually, people stood on their doorsteps and on their balconies and applauded the health workers. And that was a very profound lesson to us, because the frontline workers generally are the people with, low pay, insecure livelihoods, sometimes hounded by productivity targets that make their jobs more and more difficult. And yet they turned out to be the people who saved our lives. And I think of all the lessons from the pandemic, that is the one we must not allow ourselves to forget, that capitalism must not be allowed to forget the most important people in society and the function that they play in literally saving our lives.
Right. Another aspect, important aspect of your book is that you the reference to matter and to the limits of our planet, of ourselves as human beings. Well, we think that science has a critical role to play in the impact economy to foster like good solutions. Do you think science is really, well, is in the debate, in the discussion, or not enough?
I think it's not enough. Science has a really difficult role to play, and we have to kind of be upfront about that. Science is complicated. We're dealing with complicated understandings about the planet, about the climate, about the limits to growth, about the economy itself, and you cannot expect that everyone, and in particular that your politicians, are necessarily going to be conversant with that science and the depths of that science in their daily work. What is the daily work of a politician? It is to represent your constituencies, to take place in arguments in Parliament, which can range from health to wealth via climate change or industrial productivity. And this is a huge amount of knowledge that science represents, but is difficult to translate into political action. So there is a real challenge, I think, to find ways to integrate science into policy and to communicate science. And this is, again, one of the lessons of the book, that in communicating itself, science tends to draw on metaphors and myths. And those metaphors and myths can be very, very powerful, but they can also lead us astray if we take them too seriously. So science needs its stories in order to communicate to us, and those stories have to be resonant. They have to resonate for us. But when they become so powerful that they take over our lives, and that becomes a difficult, dangerous place, and then we have to turn back to science, not in its storytelling fashion, but in its depth and its complexity, and retranslate the lessons of science into policy.
Okay. No, it's interesting, very interesting. And beyond policy, the startups, the corporates who are integrating like the impact, ESG, etc. Of course, there is some marketing about it, but to embed science, I think, makes it more reliable as well.
Absolutely. I mean, a very important initiative in my mind is this idea of science-based targets for the carbon footprint of firms, for example, and having a process through which firms can plan for a zero carbon future and be accredited for doing so, and ensure that the calculations they're making about their carbon footprint are robust, and having the guidance to do that. That's a really important part of the transition that we're going to have to make.
Yeah, sure. So your book is so called to, well, as you mentioned it earlier, to balance, to introspection, and to accepting our limits. But you also say that us as human beings, we all need a myth, and maybe the myth of growth is, at least in our Occidental, well, Western countries, is no longer the good one. But do we need, what kind of anchor could we have, and what kind of measurements linked to it? Might it be prosperity or something else? What do you think?
One of my earliest pieces of work, actually, was a report to the UK government, was really about that idea of prosperity and how we should redefine prosperity, because prosperity itself had sort of been taken over by the myth of growth. And so creating a different sort of narrative, a different metaphor, is really important. And I think balance, to some extent, can take us somewhere. It's not exactly a myth in itself, but it's definitely a metaphor for how we could live, rather than simply accumulating more and more, finding that place of balance where we have rich human lives, where we have real social and collective well-being. And so perhaps, well-being is actually a target that we could put in place of the myth of growth, and argue that this is a better thing to measure. And when we start to measure it, of course, one of the first things we'll measure is health, but we'll also measure things like, our ability to participate in society, the strength of our communities, the ability to have decent, meaningful, purposeful work. All of these things are things that contribute to a different kind of myth, a myth of the well-being of people within the safe limits of a finite planet.
Yes. Okay. No, it makes sense. What I'm missing though is an indicator, because as you mentioned,
Sure.
it's GDP growth. Well, it's been here for a while, and it's comparable. We have national statistics. Sometimes they are not precise, but usually it's comparable. It's difficult to have this kind. Not every economy, not every system is comparable, but we need an anchor, like if not a number, something that gives us.
Yeah, no, I have nothing against numbers, Marianne. I think they're really important, but the question is, can we reliably assess our entire progress on the basis of one number? And I think not. So I think that tells us that we need a variety of different kinds of indicators. And the first and foremost, actually, I would put indicators of health and mental health and community well-being at the front of that, guiding government, guiding policy towards targets that are set in terms of, the degree of our life expectancy, the degree of the mental health of our children, the degree of our trust in our communities. And these are all things that are to some extent measurable, things you can put numbers on and guide policy through. And in fact, the government of New Zealand has such an indicator framework, which it uses to assess its spending decisions in very much the same way that we would use GDP, the gross domestic product, economic growth, to assess our spending decisions. It's a different approach.
Or complementary, yeah.
Or complementary, yeah.
And so if we push it further, let's say we transform capitalism for real, and who think is responsible, not accountable, responsible, in charge of it? Can it be individual initiatives? Like, we see rising awareness of all that, of population. We are seeing startups and companies that are trying to do the right thing. Or do we need an architect, like the government? Does it need to be like accountable for it, in charge of it? How does it work between all this?
This is a really interesting question. To me, and as part of what I was trying to do in post-growth, was to give people the resources to think through these issues and the complexity of them, the challenges of them, to challenge our own cultural worldview, as you were saying through that quote from Lynn Margulis right at the beginning. And that is a process that people can do as individuals. And there is a process too that companies can do, as you said, companies trying to do the right thing as companies. But for as long as they're doing it in a playing field, if you like, that is working against them, then there's only so far that we can expect change to happen. And for me, that's why government remains an absolutely essential part of this conversation. It must provide that framework, its duty. Thomas Jefferson once said, the care of human life and happiness, and not its destruction, is the first and only task of government. That is why, to some extent, we've invented a system in which governments are there to create and to nurture the conditions for the good life of its citizens.
Yes, no, I think we agree. That's why we wanted to bring together all the actors that can support the impact economy in the forum, because it can't be a single individual, single company. We need, as you say, a level playing field, or something that gathers initiative, push them, and facilitate them in the end.
I think that's critically important, Marianne. But I would say, maybe just in finishing, that that doesn't mean that there's no room for individual change. It doesn't mean there's no room for individual companies actually to do the right thing, even in a world that is going in the wrong direction. And to some extent, that's not just a responsibility, it is also the right of every individual and every country, a company and every country, to do that.
Yeah, okay. Well, it was super interesting to talk to you and to have a little bit more about to know more about your books and your thoughts. It's a very like not only thought provoking but inspiring book as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I understand that it was more meant to inspire, whereas Prosperity Without Growth was more of a toolkit. So I
Exactly.
think,
in some sense, you can sort of read the two books together, and one will give you the toolkit and one will give you resources. I like to think of these resources of the thinking of many people over a long period of time as still being there for us. Their wisdom is still present for us. And that's really what I wanted to show in Post Growth. I admire the work you're doing, and I wish you well with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. It was great connecting with you and having this conversation.
Thanks, Marianne.
Bye-bye.